Hollywood has a problem when it comes to realism, and it's connected to the resurgence of terms like dark, gritty, and realistic. Oftentimes, it seems like they're used as though they're just kind of synonymous with hollow, lifeless, and empty. To help make my point, I'm going to get into a little bit of writing terminology here. There's a term called polyphony, which was sort of borrowed from music. If you break it down literally, it would mean many voices. Now, that's kind of easier to understand when it comes to music, but when it comes to writing, basically what it means is that realism is about multiple, completely and utterly different points of view, different voices, different perspectives, emotions, and attitudes coming together all around the same subject or event. Doing this kind of brings nuance and complexity to your writing in ways that might not have originally been planned. It helps encourage the reader to make their own connections, link things together, just like we do in real life when unexpected things happen. So, polyphony means to tell your story, but not at the cost of everything else in the story's world. Kind of like a single drum beat versus an entire orchestra. That single drum beat will be called homophony, and it's kind of the opposite. It would mean taking one single voice and applying it to everything in the story. So, what's all of this got to do with Nolan and his Batman trilogy? Well, when it comes to tone, he's actually very homophonous, which, if you watched my Man of Steel review, is probably already starting to sound kind of familiar. Because this whole thing is kind of a reason why the entire DCEU hasn't been working. The crux of the problem with Nolan is that everything is kind of muted into this one homophonous tone. Everything kind of feels like the same perspective, the same outlook. It's like everyone in the entire universe is suffering from the same mild form of depression. That's actually the opposite of realism. And before you cut me off, the problem isn't necessarily that it's a dark tone, not at all. The problem is that it's unrelenting in all aspects for all people at all times and in every way. It's completely pervasive. But there are movies that have done this sort of pervasive dark tone and done it effectively. But they're kind of rare. They're always sort of these long shots that studios don't seem to have much faith in. Like 2014's Judge Dredd, for example. It flew completely under most people's radar because of the lack of marketing. It's actually an extremely unrelentingly dark, gritty, and realistic movie in terms of character psychology and action anyway. But Dredd is also an impossible badass. There's a time-slowing drug and psychic powers. And even though the movie is kind of unrelentingly gritty, watching it is like a joyous experience. It's got something to say, and it does it in a way that's fundamentally interesting and entertaining. It's bursting with creativity and energy, despite its grit and grime. It's energetic, it's got variation, it's up and down. That adds a richness and entertainment value to the movie. So the problem is that Nolan's version of realism is actually kind of counterproductive. It's a flawed conceptualization that actually just ends up narrowing things down. This becomes even more of a problem when you realize that the DCEU kind of took this conceptualization of realism and really ran with it. But even if the DCEU had taken a legitimately more realistic approach, the second thing that I want to argue about this is that that was never going to be the right approach anyway. Now, psychological realism is absolutely necessary in a movie. You have to be able to feel for characters and empathize with them. But here's the thing, we don't like superheroes because they're realistic. We like them because they can do things we can't, because they're ridiculous, outrageous, larger than life, exciting and dramatic, and philosophically relevant in ways that you're not likely to encounter in the real world. I mean, not always, obviously, but that's sort of what superheroes are when they're at their best. They're inherently and fundamentally unrealistic. So, who the hell ever asked for complete realism in their superhero movies? You don't make things more grounded by neutering the most fantastical, outrageous, and exciting, interesting parts of superheroes. You just make them way more fucking boring. In summary, the current DCEU's run of problems all started back with Nolan, and it's easiest to see when looking at the character of Batman himself.